Very good.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Absolutely wonderful to have you here for the 6th annual Adventure Risk Research Symposium. My name is Claire Dellett, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Jeff Jackson. Yeah, that's right.
We practiced that.
Our show. Yeah.
No, it is really great. It's amazing sitting here 6 years after this all started, and it's wonderful to see some familiar faces and lots of new faces. I want to acknowledge that Jeff and I, and many of us actually here, are sitting on the lands, the traditional lands, in Salt Lake City of the Shoshone, the Gushute, the Paiute, the Dene, and the Ute peoples. And I feel very privileged to be sitting and learning and collaborating on this land. Jeff.
So we are here in collaboration with the Wilderness Risk Managers Conference. We've really just piggybacked with that because of many of the like-minded folks are at the same time. But you know what? We quickly outgrew the geographic reach of one conference, and now we've got people from India and Australia and Canada and all across the United States and elsewhere all in the same call. So it's taken on a life of its own, which is pretty cool. So what are we doing here? This was created initially, and it maintains this agenda of being a forum for people to share what they're working on, make connections, identify what like-minded people are out there doing interesting things, and that creates, for our own world of adventure research, it creates a format, it creates a family and a community that we end up sharing and becoming pretty closely connected. Personally, I think I've maybe now published 3 articles with people that I've worked with right here in this format that we've then spun into something else and turned it into a bigger line of research. And there's real value in that to the wider adventure industry, which was really our goal. Turn our little ideas that we are attached to and create a platform that we can turn that into something else. So we have a great lineup. We have 5 folks. How does this work? So folks are going to present what the research that they're working on. They then, people have yet to do this, we'll submit a short paper, and those short papers get edited down and get reviewed. We then publish those for free. So stay tuned to the Adventure Risk Research Symposium website. You just Google that. You can go back and find the first 5 years worth of papers in there, and then you'll find this newest round as well. Here's another trick in the research world. Take these same researchers' names and go and plug them into ResearchGate, or just Google them, and you can see what other things they're working on and other research that they've been publishing. And really that's how this network grows, is by the connections and the work that we'd all been doing. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to our first presenter, Brendan Madden. Brendan, take it some time just to frame who you are and where you are before you kind of launch into the project that you're working on. And we have time afterwards for each of these presentations as well for folks to field any questions, either via mic or in the chat box, either one. We'll get to all of those, assuming we can stay on time. Basically 15 minutes plus 5 or 10 for a discussion at the end of that. Brennan, why don't you share your screen and you can take it away.
Great. I actually don't have a presentation. I'm just going to talk.
Go for it.
That's okay. And I'm just going to talk if that's not okay, because
that's super new. That's new school.
That is.
Yeah, we're just going to tell a story. I was a little worried about the Wi-Fi quality here at the hotels. Decided to just give you my shiny head to look at as I talk through here. So my name is Brendan Madden. I'm the head of program risk at Outward Bound Canada. I live on Vancouver Island in Canada. So that's what I do for my day job. I'm also a student in the master's degree in disaster and emergency management program at Royal Roads University in British Columbia. And so this, my interests in wildfire risk management are both professional. Through my work, we manage programs in Canada in wildfire hazard areas quite a lot. And personal, I've lived in wildfire hazard areas quite a lot, and then now academic with my my research for my thesis for my master's program. So, and I want to emphasize at the start here, what I'm going to talk about here is very much based on the North American context, which is my experience. I understand that there are people here from all around the world, and there may be different things going on with wildfire management in your country. And if you note a thing when I say there's a gap or a deficiency, and if you have something different in your country that you'd like to share with me afterwards, please do get a hold of me and share that. That'd be immensely helpful for my research and knowledge, because I know there's a lot of fantastic work being done around the country, around the world, in Australia and other places. So What I want to talk about today is wildfire hazard rating systems. And what got me thinking about this was my own personal experience. I've been managing outdoor groups in conditions of wildfire hazard for about 30 years now. During that time, I've realized that we use a lot of different danger scales in outdoor adventure programming. For example, if we're in avalanche terrain in North America, we have a system that rates the avalanche danger from low to extreme. And if you're a company, a guiding company, a heli ski operator, etc., you will gauge your practices according to the scale. So in low avalanche danger, you're just going to ski everywhere and have fun. In considerable avalanche danger, you're going to be really managing the risk, digging avalanche pits, evaluating the weather, all that sort of thing. And extreme conditions, you might not ski at all. You might just stay at the lodge and play backgammon for a few days. So there's a variance of practice that occurs along with the danger scale. Similarly, in whitewater world, we have a system of rating the danger of rivers from 1 to 5. And you might take a highly adventurous group in whitewater rafts on a class 5 river with expert guides, but you likely wouldn't take a group of canoeists who are beginners on that class 5 river. You would gauge that to a much lower level of hazard. Similarly, again, with sea kayaking, we have places like in British Columbia where the terrain and ocean conditions are rated from 1 to 4, with the idea that you need to gauge the qualifications of the organization to the level of the hazard. So that concept we find all the way through outdoor adventure. When it gets to wildfire, it works a little bit differently, and that's what I want to focus on a little bit today. So wildfire hazard in North America is rated along very similar scale from low to extreme. The difference, though, is that for an outdoor company operating in wildfire hazard terrain, there's little or no guidance available on how to change your behavior according to the scale. And really what we see is how the true scale works is you have 1, business as usual, 2, there's a fire ban instituted, and 3, the authorities close the backcountry. The interesting part there is business as usual can occur along the full range of the scale. So we have groups traveling and camping in low wildfire hazard all the way up to extreme, and there's really no guidance on any change of practice all the way along the scale. I think one of the problems and definitely my research has illuminated this, one of the problems that creates this situation is that most modeling and most research that's done around wildfire refers to the mid-range of the risk. So the kind of wildfires we're most used to seeing that are somewhat moderate, somewhat predictable. But what we're starting to see more is extreme wildfire events. An example would be in June of 2021, there was an event happened at a little town called Lytton in British Columbia in Canada. On June 29th, they hit a record temperature of 49.5 degrees Celsius. That's 121 degrees Fahrenheit for the Americans in the audience. That happened on June 29th. That record was 5 degrees Celsius higher than the previous Canadian record. So that's quite a jump in one day. The next day, the town was gone. An extreme wildfire event occurred, whipped up by some winds. Townspeople were given 15 minutes to evacuate, and the town was obliterated. Luckily, all the people made it out alive. There weren't any fatalities in that event. Interestingly, though, in the reporting that was done, the winds were described as strong winds that had created this extreme wildfire event. The wind gusts were actually 35 kilometers an hour, gusting to 50 kilometers an hour. Again, for the Yanks, that's 21 miles an hour to 31 miles per hour. So not what we'd consider particularly strong winds, yet they created an extreme wildfire event that destroyed a town in a little over an hour. And we've seen similar stories evolve in Maui, in California, in Chile, in Australia, and other places. So this tells us that even though extreme wildfire events are still not what we're commonly running into in the backcountry, the risk of running into them in the backcountry is increasing over time, and we need to change our practices accordingly. But so far, in my experience, we're not. Another relevant point is that the winds I mentioned not only blow up the fire to extreme conditions, the same winds also ground air evacuation options, which is really relevant to us in the outdoor adventure world. We see that I think one of the reasons why there hasn't been more guidance around this is wildfire risk managers are overwhelmed with capacity issues in North America right now, and they're concentrating their resources quite understandably on urban centers and on houses and settlements in the urban wildland interface. This makes sense, but it does leave the backcountry users a little bit hanging in terms of resources and support. In my research on wildfire in the backcountry, really the research that's out there is sparse. And interestingly, most of the research that does exist either talks about wildfire smoke, which is a serious concern, or wildfire logistics, i.e. the fact that when a wildfire happens, backcountry may be closed and you may have to cancel a program and that sort of thing. Again, a real concern. But what is mentioned in almost none of the research I've been able to find is wildfire actually posing a fatality threat to backcountry users. And as again, the threat of extreme wildfires, while still not a common occurrence for us to run into in the backcountry, is increasing over time, I think this is a serious gap. So we have two trends happening at the same time. Backcountry use rates are increasing, and the rates of extreme wildfire are increasing apace. I think this puts us on a collision course for a catastrophic backcountry event where an outdoor adventure program is trapped by an extreme wildfire event. And this means it's time to create new systems and practices. So my research is going to focus on defining how we could create a new backcountry user wildfire risk framework that considers both mid-range and worst case scenario wildfire risks. We want to start to close the research gap around wildfire hazard for backcountry users. We want to develop clear guidance for different behavior according to different wildfire hazard levels. We need to create better monitoring and forecasting systems, cohesive early warning systems. And how do we do this? I think it's through a partnered approach between outdoor adventure programs, wilderness land managers, Indigenous First Nations, wildland firefighters, researchers, and others. And I will stop there and ask if there are any questions. Don't be shy.
Brendan, thank you for that. I've got one, or maybe more of a comment in some ways. It brings me back to 2009 in Australia, where we had the Black Saturday bushfires, and they were horrendous. It was a horrendous event. A lot of people lost their lives. The heat beforehand, again, a lot of people lost their lives through heat-related illnesses. But one of the questions we asked ourselves after those fires in Australia was, what if Black Saturday was a Black Wednesday? Would we have been out there? Would we have had groups out in the field? Because at the time, as you say, it was very similar in Australia. There were no thresholds. There were no decision frameworks or planning frameworks for, going into the bush or going into the wilderness at all around that. And I guess that's, in some ways, I think a lot has changed in Australia since then, but there's still a lot to go. There's still not necessarily an agreed approach, and I'm not sure if there can be. I'm interested in sort of what your thoughts are. I completely concur with what you've just said, and I applaud it. I'm interested in what you think it might look like down the road.
Great question. I don't think we're there yet. I think we need to move there as quickly as we can. And the two things that are really clear, again, are when you see the graphs of when people are heading into the backcountry, they spike. And you see graphs of when extreme wildfires happening and they spike at the same time. So that's the focal point. So I think, I know you folks in Australia have asked the question about how do we get more micro forecasting rather than a forecast for a whole general area, but is it more safe to go to one valley versus the next valley over, and trying to develop that capacity so we can do more micro forecasting. I think that's part of the solution, because we need better info and better data, because the thing that's really changing in Canada fast over the last 2 years is we're starting to see authorities reach for the button, close the backcountry, which is completely understandable, and in high risk situations it's defendable, it makes sense, but hopefully that's not going to be the only tool in the toolbox, because that means we gradually, or maybe not gradually, lose access to backcountry adventures if fires get worse. So it's developing that capacity, I think, for micro planning.
Thank you.
Brooklyn, you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. Thanks for that. That's great, Brendan. Very relevant to me. I actually live in Jasper National Park, so just went through all of this chaos, and have a lot of friends who work in visitor safety. So had got to know their experience evacuating people from the backcountry, and it sounded very, very hectic. And I think still like they're experiencing the lasting impacts of just the mental stress of that. So your work is super important. One question I have for you, and thoughts on this. I used to work for the local destination marketing organization here, and there seems to be a hesitancy within that organization and also with Parks Canada that I'm noticing on kind of like proactive visitor messaging on wildfire preparedness. And I know as a resident, we get lots of messaging from the local municipality on, fire smarting, being proactive in evacuation. How would you recommend, I don't know if you've thought about this, like balancing that, come to our destination, but be prepared? That's one thing that I'm noticing. There's a lot of hesitancy. And I just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it needs to be developed. I think that gets to that. Can we have different levels of behavior change along the fire hazard continuum, rather than going to we just do the same thing we always do until the situation's so desperate that we're closing the backcountry and evacuating people by helicopter? Surely there are different gradations we can do. They're different. One of the things I'm really looking at in my research is, and this is something the UN really focuses on, is the idea of early warning systems. So if you have really robust communication systems, maybe that gives you the confidence to, okay, we can alert people in this area that they need to actually start moving towards the trailhead before we have a problem. That's really problematic for us in Canada, because we don't have a technological system for that right now. So in areas where you have cell service everywhere, you can do a cell net and just broadcast a message to everybody's cell phone in that area. It doesn't work in the Canadian backcountry. So we need a different solution. So it's figuring out things like if we had a really dependable communication system, we could again alter behavior along the spectrum rather than just working at the extreme of behavior.
Yeah, good. Brendan, Cecil asked if you see something similar to the EITS, the Parks Canada avalanche terrain rating scale system. As a model, something along that?
Yeah, I think that has a lot of potential. I mean, the Parks Canada has done some fantastic work around that. The idea of rating terrain complexity and difficulty so that people can self-select. Oh, I'm somebody of modest skill, so I'm going to stay in simple terrain. That idea of terrain mapping has tremendous potential for wildfire. So it's like, okay, I don't have a ton of experience. I don't want to take a lot of risks. So I want to only recreate in areas that have really easy egress in case the fire conditions get bad. So creating a mapping system like that has tremendous potential. Parks Canada has done wonderful work in the avalanche sphere with that stuff. Yeah.
That's great. All right. Thanks, Brendan. We're going to move on just to keep our presenters on topic here. Thanks so much for that. So that's Brendan Madden, And if you need help connecting with some of these presenters, you just reach out to Claire or myself, and we're happy to make sure that those connections can work and we can release those. Thank you very much, Brendan. And we look forward to seeing your short paper as you kind of chunk out your ideas a little more and into the future too. Let's go on to number 2. Brooklyn Rushton joining us from Jasper, as she inferred in her question earlier. Brooklyn, why don't you tell us about the work you're doing surveying mountaineers and their perspectives on climate change?
Awesome. I will just share my screen here. Is everyone able to see that?
That is your driver screen, so that's okay, but you might want to flip to your
Let
other
me
screen.
just flip that around here. I'm just going to unplug the monitor. I feel like I'm used to using, is that working now? Okay.
Same thing. It's your driver screen.
Here, let me just do that. There we go. That's
There you go.
Yeah, you're good.
Thank you. Technology is hard, you know. Yeah, so my name is Brooklyn Rushton. I'm a PhD candidate at Wilfrid Laurier University, and thanks, Jeff, for the opportunity to present. Jeff and I met, I think, 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, at online at a knowledge sharing workshop. And so, yeah, I didn't even realize this symposium was going on. So I'm definitely looking forward to attending in the future as well. So I'm presenting today on some research I did in collaboration with a few folks, Kate Hanley and Dr. Graham McDowell from University of Calgary, Dr. Christopher Lemieux from Wilfrid Laurier University, and then a colleague overseas, Dr. Emmanuel Salim, who works in France. And we did some research called Adventuring on Thin Ice, Perceptions, Adaptations, and Adaptive Capacity of Canadian Mountaineers in the Face of Climate Change. So a bit about myself first. So as mentioned, I live in Jasper National Park on Treaty 6 and 8 territories. And I wear a few different hats. So, coming today on with my PhD candidate hat on, and my research generally focuses on the intersection of the nature-based tourism industry in Canada and large-scale disruptions. So climate change, COVID-19. And I'm really interested in how those disruptions can really be an opportunity for change towards sustainable and regenerative practices in the industry. I also work for a charitable organization where we focus on local mountain communities and their increasing their resilience to climate change impacts. So we work with a lot of municipalities across Canada. And then I also work as for a guiding company part-time in Jasper. So that's kind of my fun job, get off the screen, get moving around the mountain landscape. So that's really been I think, where the inspiration for this research has really come out of, alongside my own recreational pursuits. I really enjoy skiing and running and climbing in the mountains. And I think, working with a lot of guides, I got really inspired just hearing the stories of them. A lot of the guides that I work with have been in the mountains for 30 plus years. So they've witnessed that change throughout the course of their career. So I've done some research with mountain guides as well in the past, but this research is really focused on recreationalists. So a bit of an agenda, I'll just talk a bit about the background, climate change and mountaineering and that intersection just briefly, and then really just dive into research question, methodology, key findings, and future research in this space. So I think we all know, mountain ecosystems are really vital for tourism and outdoor recreation. We can see an expansion globally in mountain tourism, but also locally or nationally in Canada. I for sure, witnessed that living in Jasper National Park. We're definitely seeing a rise in visitation over time. But we also see that mountain ecosystems they're highly sensitive to climate change impacts. So I know mountains are really called sentinels of climate change, and you can see the impacts physically in front of your eyes. I work a lot on the Athabasca Glacier, and year over year, we're witnessing changes, not only over the course of the season, but, I've worked there for the last 4 years. And so I've just myself even witnessed that change. So that's really always been my inspiration for the work that I do. And then we'll actually focus more specifically on mountaineering specifically. We can see, climate change, and this, I know we all know this, increased temperatures, that can increase objective hazards in the landscape, because it kind of creates a rise in rockfall, icefall, avalanche risk, that kind of thing. We also see those increased temperatures leading to glacial retreat, glacial recession, and that can actually have a huge impact on historical routes and the lack of accessibility due to hazardous conditions, or just actually not being able to access regions anymore. And we also see unpredictable weather really leading to those unpredictable conditions that people face while they're out in the mountains. And all of that really has a huge impact on mountaineer safety and experience, and that can increase risk in many regions. And so when I went through the literature, really focused on this area, I started with the mountaineer or the mountain guide research. I did that a few years ago with the Association of Canadian Mountain Guides. But I really noticed there was a huge gap in recreationalists. There's been a little bit of work in Europe and a little bit in New Zealand, but there was no studies in a Canadian context. And I think, there's lots of synergies across mountain regions across the world. But when you think about climate change, it has really localized impacts. So while we share a lot with Europe, there are specific things to Canada that are a little bit different, just even the way that our mountain communities are, established and function. So that's where that localized understanding is really important. So that's really where this research gap I wanted to fill with my own work. So here is our research question. How do Canadian recreational mountaineers perceive and adapt to the impacts of climate change in Canada's mountain regions? So what we did is we worked with the Alpine Club of Canada. So we did an online survey with their members. We had a mix of 22 questions, open and closed-ended, and they were really focused on understanding the perceptions of climbers, how their behaviors are shifting towards, adopting adaptation strategies. And we had 252 respondents, so about 1.6% of the ACC's membership. And when we go into our key findings, so starting with climate change concern, we saw that 95% of climbers believe that climate change is happening. I almost don't even want to say believe anymore because I don't think it's something that you believe in at this point, but we're still maybe there. And we saw that, and that's way above the Canadian average. I think it's around 72% from the last national study that was done. And then we saw that 74% of climbers are very concerned or extremely concerned. We also asked the impacts that climbers are seeing on the landscape. So we saw a noted increase in hazards like icefall, rockfall, avalanches, crevasse risk, reduced access to historical routes, as I kind of mentioned before, and a loss of scenic beauty in mountain environments. And all of that really impacts the safety, accessibility, and overall enjoyment of mountaineering. And one thing I found particularly interesting is that 63% of climbers express that they are concerned about losing meaningful life experiences in the mountains. And that's a big piece. A lot of people who engage in mountaineering, and really any sport that's in the mountain landscapes, I think become a really big part of our identity. And so that's a piece that I think, and I'll note that a bit of future research needs to be done in that space. I know for myself, that's a big part of why I live where I live and who I am. And so climate change has a huge impact on that. There's also an increased perception of risks. So 87% of climbers reported an increased awareness of objective hazards, as I mentioned before, rockfall, icefall, avalanches, crevasses. And also 74% of climbers expressed that climbing has become significantly riskier due to all these hazards and the impacts of climate change. So definitely an interesting thing, because I think, mountaineering, you're ultimately always engaging in some kind of risk, but that risk becomes increased. And I think the one thing that's also interesting, we didn't really explore it in this one, but we did in the mountain guide one, is that climbers, especially guides, use historical data, and we always do that as humans to make decisions. And now that historical data may not actually work in our favor going forward. So that's something that I'm quite interested in. We didn't really dive too much into this just because it was a first, exploratory study. It's something that I'm definitely interested in learning more about. And then we looked at specific climate-related risk as well. So glacial retreat and thinning ice was noted to have made a huge impact on classic routes becoming more dangerous or sometimes even impassable. And specifically when we talk about rockfall frequency, that's becoming more frequent on well-established routes and become quite hazardous. And it's also very hard to predict as well. And I'll get into that a little bit as we go through some examples. And then also, as I mentioned, the loss of historic routes. So sometimes these routes become so, they change beyond recognition for some climbers. So we can see some examples. So this is in Bugaboo Provincial Park in British Columbia. For those of you who don't know this region, it's definitely a world-class alpine climbing destination, beautiful granite rock. I love this region. This is a snow patch spire, and a few years ago, we had an extreme cold event that actually collapsed the entire rock face. And you can see that area in the red box on the left side, lots of famous routes on that region. So just kind of lucky that it happened during the winter, but you really see those, with climate change, we're having these extreme cold and hot heat events. So again, something that we're just going to continually see. Also in Squamish, this is the Chief, which is a very popular climbing area. And a few years ago, I think it's 2021, they had a massive rockfall event on the Chief during a huge heat wave. And granite generally just doesn't like extreme heat and extreme cold and just general rock in mountain regions. So that's something that I think we'll continually see. And again, these two events were just super lucky. I think this one happened during the middle of the night, so no one was there, but there are many rock roots on this area that did collapse. So kind of just continually getting lucky. And there has been some events. I know I think it was in Italy a few years ago, a huge glacial collapse that killed 11 people. So it's one of those things that, in Canada, we've been kind of spared with these large mountain collapses, but it's, they're going to continually happen, right? So we need to be able to, those early warning signs, as Brendan mentioned, be able to kind of understand those. This is Mount Athabasca, in one of the mountains that I really enjoy climbing, and I have a love for, I would say. And you can see massive glacial recession over the last century. And this has definitely changed the nature of a lot of the routes, made them a lot more risky. One of the routes that I particularly have done with a guide who I work with, he said 20 years ago, he used to walk hands in his pockets up there, and now it's like ice axe to the side, constantly making steps. So, significant change over that, increase in objective hazard. It's still passable, but the mountain's changing significantly over the years. And then lastly here is Abbott Pass Hut. I'm sure many on the call who maybe are from Canada know about this one. So huge base for climbing in Banff, but in the last, I think it was 2021, it got taken down. You can see the permafrost degradation that happened over the last century, and that was a huge loss to the mountaineering community. And they are talking about maybe rebuilding it somewhere, but that area is just becoming like significantly more hazardous, even just accessing the col that this hut was in. We also looked into how climate change is impacting the motivation of mountaineers. So one thing that was interesting is that many climbers were actually motivated to complete routes before they disappear and really be connected to environments that may not exist in the future. So this really feeds into that last chance tourism narrative that some might be aware of, but really just experiencing those landscapes before they disappear. And then there were some climbers as well who really motivated to seek, fresher environments, especially during the summer months when we have those heat waves. I know for myself, I'm often like, get me in the alpine away from the valley bottom when it gets really, really hot. But again, there's that risk when you have those heat events as well in the mountains. And then we also asked about how mountaineers are adapting to climate change. So one thing we noticed was an increase in strategic preparedness. So one tactic that mountaineers are using is really increasing the time and energy they spend on research and planning and weather and climbing conditions. And a big piece of that is really diversifying the information that they seek. So a lot of times, there's guidebooks for many regions in Canada and in climbing routes, but a lot of those guidebooks, some of the route descriptions are, 50 years old. And I know myself, I've been out before where, it says there's a nice glacier that you can go up and it's actually completely receded and it's too dangerous. So I've experienced that for myself. So definitely shifting in the mountaineering community to really focus on more information sharing through online forums, social media, climbing networks, personal exchange, adapting gear. So some mountaineers noted bringing more rock gear due to reduced snow and ice. And then also adjusting their training and their partners' select choice. So additional training was sought by many respondents to really increase their understanding, and then also being more selective with their partner choices and avoiding solo objectives as well. There's also some notes on substitution behavior. So we had temporal substitution really focused on, daily. So a lot of climbers are starting earlier, especially during the summer months, to avoid diurnal warming risks with rockfall, icefall, and avalanches. So really that heat impact. Also seeing some seasonal shifts to avoid hazards like wildfire smoke and even those warming patterns, unreliable snow and ice features. So definitely shifting more earlier in the summer, kind of, as we ease into fall as well. There was some spatial substitution, so people changing the regions that they go climbing just to have more safe and, predictable conditions as well. We saw more experienced climbers were actually more likely to travel further, probably just due to a love for the sport as well. And then some climbers also have just switched activities when mountaineering conditions were hazardous. Whether they're, still in the mountaineering umbrella, maybe they're doing some sport climbing or something like that, where it's a little bit less risk exposure. Or some people actually just have decided to just quit mountaineering altogether. It was a small percentage of that, but that was an interesting one as well. And the last bucket of adaptation strategies that we noted were mindset adjustments. So really that shift in risk perception, that a lot of mountaineers had an increased perception of risk, which really led them to change their decision-making. And some mountaineers are focused on choosing objectives that are less exposed to physical hazards. Another one here is really adjusting their priorities. So really putting a little bit of greater emphasis on the route conditions over their personal skill sets for safety, and then also building a bit of flexibility into their plan. So having a backup, plan B, plan C, so they can kind of shift depending on the conditions they see when they're out on the landscape. Also noted heightened vigilance when they're actually in the environment. So really having, their eye on heat-related hazards as they come throughout the day. And then lastly is, feeding into that is really adapting climbing style, shifting towards faster and lighter climbing to reduce exposure to hazards, and also more frequently roping up on glaciers where they traditionally would just solo it without a rope. And then we also noted some determinants of adaptation. So we saw some differences in employment and income levels, where more people who were unemployed or lower income were actually more likely to change the location where they're climbing, which is kind of interesting. Whereas higher income climbers were more likely to change their activity, which makes sense, more financial resources, you can actually buy all that gear to shift over. We saw experience level played a huge impact on what adaptation strategies were adopted, where people who are more experienced could change their location and the time, where less experienced climbers were more likely to shift activities or actually discontinue mountaineering. And that, to me, it kind of makes sense. It's really just they haven't got connected to the sport to really tough it out, I guess you could say. And then motivation and urgency also fed into there, which I found was interesting as well. Some less experienced climbers were actually really motivated to climb just routes that thought would be disappearing soon, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I think that sense of urgency, especially in less experienced climbers, can actually really increase their risk exposure because they feel very motivated to climb something, but they might actually do it in very risky conditions. So it was an interesting one for me from a risk perspective. And the last two ones here, one climbing partners, we saw people who actually climbed with a guide were more likely to continue climbing despite the impacts of climate change, which really makes sense. Guides have this experience to kind of mitigate more of those risks and climate-related risks. And then last level of concern, and this one, is probably a little bit self-explanatory. Those with a greater concern about climate change are more likely to adopt adaptation strategies versus those with lower concern were less likely to adopt those strategies. And then we just dive into future research here. One thing I'm quite interested in is kind of those biophysical limits of adaptation. So we talk about that as really those limits occur when additional adaptation strategies or adaptive measures become impractical, ineffective, or unacceptable. When we look at it from a mountaineering perspective, this really feeds into that certain routes or activities may no longer be viable with climate change hazards as they escalate, and mountaineers may reach a point where adaptations cannot sufficiently mitigate these risks. And I think this bucket really deserves future attention and research. We need continuous monitoring of changing conditions and really understanding the feasibility of certain adaptation actions. That's something that hasn't really been explored too much, and really just further education and awareness on the impacts of climate change and what kind of strategies are feasible and maybe unviable eventually. Other pieces here, more need to focus on underrepresented groups. Our demographic profile for this was mostly white male, which is very, dominated historically in the outdoor recreation space, but definitely shifting significantly. So I think more focus on those underrepresented groups and, the experiences and perceptions that they have would be really interesting. Understanding the feasibility and the impact of some educational and awareness campaigns and initiatives. those longitudinal studies are really looking at, long-term how people's perceptions and behaviors change over time, I think would be really interesting. Psychological impacts, as I mentioned before, like a lot of people who engage in these types of activities really it's part of their identity. So when they feel like it's threatened through climate change, that can have, I assume, a lot of psychological impacts, which I think would be an interesting type of study. And then that early warning system, so similar to Brendan mentioned, especially with those large scale events like rockfall, events that we saw in the Bugaboos and Squamish, I think trying to understand those, because I think we're just being lucky in Canada that we haven't had a major, tragedy with human lives in those spaces. So I think some more research into that would be quite critical. And that's all for me. So happy to answer any questions. Just stop sharing now so I can see everyone again.
Thanks, Brooklyn. Any questions from folks? Good question. I got a long list of questions.
You go.
So this is fascinating. So this is a great example of natural adaptation. These folks have found a way to continue mountaineering given things that are thrown in their way, which at organizational level we can learn so much from, because organizations aren't nimble like recreation people are with a free Sunday. So I think just your substitution strategies you laid out there, that's basically a recipe card for people to consider. How does my organization build substitution into its program planning? Super useful. That's really practical to lay that out for us. That's great. Here's my other thought. So ACC, how many members would be in ACC? You got really good response to your survey.
Totally.
Did you get a sense of what was that? It's probably more than 10% of the ACC responded, I would think.
I think they have about 14,000 members actually, but I don't know if they're all super active.
Yeah.
That's the one thing. But we did get a good response rate. We did offer a bit of an incentive, which definitely helps for sure, with the prize, but we were really lucky to get a good response rate, which was great.
Yeah, very good. Because I don't want to open up a whole huge can of worms, but I know you've done the same work with the ACMG. So do mountain guides share that flexibility and substitution and that same ethos of recognizing the new and emerging risks?
Yeah, for sure. It was a very similar results actually. Flexibility was a big thing for guides, and then even just like changing different locations. They were actually shifting as well to more instructional based guiding versus objective based guiding, which I thought was really interesting, just because it just well, I think there was two pieces there. One is just the increased demand for instructional programming, but the second one was really just, it's just more stable of an environment, and they can bring people in there without, enhancing their risk and their exposure. So that was definitely a piece that I thought was really interesting. The one thing that I noted that was in the mountain guide research, it didn't really pop up here, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit in the presentation, was there was a few guides that were noting that, their practice has always just been, okay, historically, what have I done? That worked. Now I'm going to do that going forward. And there was a risk there. And I think that's kind of the biophysical limit piece. Guides spoke to the fact that they are concerned, especially younger guides who have not built up that experience, and now trying to build up that experience in a very dynamic environment is going to be quite challenging. And they actually sometimes don't know, and they can't draw on experience based on the conditions that they see with climate change. So that's a piece that just scratching the surface on that, but it really fascinates me specifically in that outdoor space, because that's really, you really build that intuition from historical experiences that you have. So that's one thing that was a bit different, I would say, between the two different research pools. And I think it's really just probably based on the amount of time the mountain guides are out in the landscape versus recreationalists. That would be my assumption.
Yeah, so good. Thanks so much, Brooklyn. So we're gonna move on to our next presenter. I look forward, Brooklyn, to seeing your kind of write up on that. I think that's a brilliant model that you've started with that we can grow from our organizational thinking. So good. Stuart Slade. Stuart, you've been continuing work on this climate change theme, haven't you? Why don't you set that up for us and tell us what you've been working on?
Okay, let me see if I can share my screen. Can you guys turn down your volume over there? Thanks. I'm in Salt Lake City at the WRMC, and a bunch of us are gathered in the main sort of ballroom to jump in. So a few folks gathered. Okay, so the story of this one, Actually, I saw Lauren Miller's face on the screen amongst all the other faces. And so Lauren spoke at the WRMC last year about climate change stuff in Australia and fires and so on. And a bunch of us were in that room, and it really struck a chord and inspired us. So we walked away and we said, we want to talk about what that means for us in North America and for our programs. And we're not nearly having as sophisticated as a conversation, it seems like, as what's happening in Australia. So we did that. Three of us on the screen there. So Jeff, myself, and Shauna, who is also on the screen, the faces on the screen, and a few other folks as well. So Brendan, who just spoke, Sam Dwami is an insurance broker, president of insurance brokerage, and John Heshka is a professor in the legal and outdoor programming spaces in Canada. And so we've been talking about this all year. Where we decided to start was to do a survey. What is the impact on programs, in our sector? And so that's what we'll talk about today. Okay, let me actually blow this up, and that might help. So, Jeff was the lead author on this, and Shauna's in the crowd as well. So any questions that come, I might toss them to other people's way as well, since we all were a part of this one. So some background, what we looked at in the literature is not a ton of stuff about lead outdoor activities or programs and providers, facilities, and that sort of thing. Going all the way back to the 80s, the ski industry in North America really started talking about this stuff first. What happens, the effects of snow cover on and what are we going to do and that sort of thing. More recently, there's been more stuff that's been published out there. For example, in 2018, folks were saying we're really relying on an outdated climate model. Stable climate has been the baseline, and that shows up in our research as well. We're still in that space. O'Toole talked about it's really challenging to translate broad concepts into tangible actions, into what does this mean for practitioners and what do we do? Well, that also showed up in our research in our survey. Dr. Miller, she talked about operational costs, loss of income, and it's catching a lot of us by surprise. Well, that also shows up in our research. And the last sort of main point is, climate change and sustainability of this whole outdoor programming thing and providers and facilitator and facilities and so on is really the elephant in the room. And that showed up also. So we did 28 question survey and we distributed it as wide as we could. Our survey was really focused on 2023 and previous operational impacts, but really honing in on 2023 and really focused on North America. You'll see in the results, others contributed, which is really nice and cool to see. The questions that we came up with, we really, where we drew that stuff from was the literature and other issues across various sectors and what are the emergent issues that are rising. So in other words, we didn't just make it up. So we piloted the survey with our close network, seeing that this actually makes sense. Once it did, we threw away the results. We started over again. I mean, the survey results anyway. We distributed it as far and as wide as we could. Last spring, opened for a couple months, and Jeff's university gave us ethics. Okay, so here's the questions, our research questions anyway. We wanted to know what is the current impact of the programs of climate change on programs and providers. We wanted to know more about how organizations are making decisions around extreme weather events and some of these impacts. And then we wanted to try to understand some level of readiness across organizations. Are they ready? How are they being ready? What does that look like? That sort of thing. So, pretty exploratory in terms of all this stuff. Okay, the findings. So actually it's helpful. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but over in the top right, starting over here, these are the sectors or the subsectors that we looked at. So the majority of respondents are from education, schools, outdoor education, that sort of thing. Guide services is next, and that goes all the way down. Facilities are included in there, all the way down to conservation groups and land management, folks of that nature. I have to move the Zoom things around so I can see the slides. So give me a second. Okay, in terms of what types of programs these folks were running, that's what this one in the bottom with the green bar graph shows. Everywhere from, multi-day is the majority to residential stuff as well. Day trips certainly is, I'm sorry, day trips is the majority. And then respondents are primarily from North America. A few folks from East and Southeast Asia, which is pretty cool, like Thailand, Southeast Asia, Korea, East Asia. South Asia as well, India and Pakistan, like 13 or so folks are from the UK and one from Brazil as well. A total of 127 organizations responded. We had to do a little bit of comparing and consolidating results. Some folks responded, multiple folks from the same organization, but in total, 127 orgs. Okay, so findings, this is what folks said is impacting them. We divided this between moderate and major impacts. So moderate impacts, heat is the number one thing that folks said of the folks that responded is affecting them. Air quality next, floods and storms, wildfires, disease, quite interesting. So think, Lyme disease and tick-borne illness, and the range of that stuff is changing. Seasonal flooding as well. Major impacts, a lot of folks are really concerned and feeling the effects of air quality, snowpack and snowfall, and that is, you'll see drastic effects on their operations if they're winter based, and wildfires as well. Okay, operational impacts, that was climate impacts. Now, what is the effect on their operations? So, and again, this is really focusing on 2023 across the folks that organizations that responded. This is number of days that were impacted, had to be revised in some way. So most folks were in this 4 to 10 range. A few folks said, well, actually every single day, we were, and then a handful of folks said we weren't impacted at all in that type of way. And then loss of access to operating areas. We know that's a big deal. Lauren Miller really highlights that, and that's something that we're seeing as well. So total loss, it's quite interesting, all the way down to, one location was lost for that season. Some folks said they didn't lose anything as well. It's kind of a range. Okay, and then that third question, organizational preparedness. We had a number of questions based on this stuff. And so, for example, one of the things we looked at was field communications. Everyone, except for one, uses some sort of technology and do some sort of check-ins with, what's happening in the field to headquarters. 24% of the respondents, they have regular planned updates with weather updates and that sort of thing. 67, so the majority of folks are saying, well, we just do it whenever it's needed. We don't have a predetermined schedule or check-in schedule when it comes to weather updates. We were curious about where are people getting information about weather. 92, the vast majority of folks said we get stuff from basic consumer weather product apps, that we all access in the public access and uses. 86%, these are called nowcasts. These are staff in the field looking at what's happening, and that's a main driver of how they make decisions organizationally. And some folks are playing with, or they have started using handheld air quality, readers in the field, certainly river level gauges, a whole host of stuff down there. Another question we asked about was about data and weather and record collection, and if folks are doing that. Interestingly, of the folks, 31% that say we do record severe weather via, like an instrument report, majority of folks said, well, that's not really like a reportable criteria to us for an incident. Our incident reporting right now is really focused on harm or damage. So if we have these events that's threatening, but they don't actually cause any harm because we change something or do something, it doesn't fall within our criteria to report it. So it's a pretty important feedback loop. Somebody said, well, actually, we have daily records going back for 10 years. You would expect that, right, of like ski areas, for example. I don't think that one was a ski area. We're asking, how do you feel in your organization in terms of being prepared for climate change or for some of these weather events? 12% they feel like they are proactively managing for the future. 60%, so quite a majority there, said we're reacting. We're like, sort of prepared. And 13% said, this is a problem, but actually it's not, organizationally, it's not on our radar yet. The majority, 34% of folks said they're taking steps with their facilities, and 4% said, well, we're planning to take steps. And we asked about insurance, you know, as you'd expect, a lot of folks said, well, we don't know actually what our insurance covers. The folks that did know, 12% have coverage, 7% said we have a lot of exclusions around this type of thing. I did that twice, 64%. We're not sure. Okay, I'm gonna go a little faster because this is a really text heavy, data packed slideshow. So knowledge gaps, we divide that between long-term uncertainty and there's short-term uncertainty in here as well. A lot of folks are really concerned about existential stuff. What happens when we lose access to our operating areas? What about financial planning, business disruption? That really aligns with what Lauren Miller was talking about, and a lot of that work. Leadership and org priority, well, there's a gap. A lot of folks are saying, well, in management, they know it's a problem. Leadership, they're not quite there yet. And so how do we get them there is what they're asking. Staff competency. Well, you know, a lot of folks are relying on nowcasts, you know, essentially what it's called. So we need to increase our staff's ability and knowledge when it comes to prediction skills and knowledge and so on. AQI is a big one. 2023, there's a lot of AQI stuff across the East Coast of the US. And that's an area where they're not used to reading that stuff and looking at it like they are in, you know, let's say California. I'll just highlight a few here. So trusted sources of info, is a big deal. A lot of folks said, I don't know where to go and who to trust for information. It's conflicting between what the local government or the federal government says and some of the regulations versus some of the guidance that's out there, like my medical advisor, for example. So who do I go to for information? And how do I access information? What is going to happen in my operating area in the long term? What should we be preparing for and planning for? So a lot of information barriers there. Participants, climate anxiety came up quite a bit. Pre-trip communication, folks are wanting to know, well, what should we be communicating with folks before we go in the field? Managing expectations, especially around changes. And we talked about some of these other things. Okay, into the discussion here. So question 1 was about present day impact. What are folks feeling? Interestingly, 3 organizations said that, well, some of these impacts are positive. We don't know why. It wasn't reported. We didn't really ask in terms of the survey format, but I thought that was quite interesting. Excuse me. A lot of folks are saying a lot of negative impacts around operational decisions, business model uncertainty. Is this really going to work for us in the future with these big changes? Financial impacts. And then here's some good quotes that I pulled that you can read. And what these quotes are really getting at is about ongoing and cascading impacts. It's not just this thing, it's not just that thing, but it's this plus that equals that. And this is like now what we're seeing, and this is why it's so darn overwhelming. And so here's some good quotes around that. Like this middle one's really good. We have huge fears about the future of our business since we rely heavily on positive outdoor experiences. We have blue algae in our lake, changing wind conditions, increases in fires and smoke and rising temperatures, and these are all big issues. It's all out of our control. But again, if we're trying to do these positive experiences, these are some negative outdoor experiences. So what does that mean for us? The short of it is, everyone seems to be experiencing and dealing with impacts from climate change. Okay, question 2 is about how are these folks making decisions? Are there organizations making decisions around these types of things? So a lot of stuff on the slide here. Interestingly, less than half have established criteria to deal with some of these hazards. So a lot of folks, they don't have written protocols, in other words, about how to deal with this stuff and decision-making frameworks and guidelines. AQI and heat came up quite a bit. And you saw earlier, that was the #1 thing. There's a lot of questions. What are the rules versus what are the guidelines? And a lot of folks are saying, well, some of that doesn't apply to us. You know, if they're saying stay indoors, that's just not possible. So what do we do? That came up quite a bit. Conflicting guidance, right? An example is the school board says this, but the local government or the federal government says this. Health impacts, a lot of people have questions about that. What does that mean for our participants? What does it mean for our staff, especially around heat and AQI and exposure to that type of thing? I'm going to skip around here. Some folks did submit their protocols to us when we looked at them. So a lot of those protocols are quite dynamic. And so what we're seeing, and everyone said, even the folks that submitted protocols that had them said, well, we're seeing the need to update these. And so what we're taking from that is the old rules around this stuff that we've been using for a while don't really seem to apply anymore to what we're seeing in the field. and across our programs. And of course, it's exhausting to keep up with all this stuff and to communicate all this stuff. So the key takeaway here, management structures, things need to change, or they need to be in place and to help drive consistent decision making. Okay, question 3 is we want to look at the readiness of these organizations and what are they saying? So some short-term and some long-term uncertainty. We covered some of this stuff before, some of long-term stuff, long-term health effects, future of our programs, sustainability of our organization, that type of stuff. So organizations have historically relied on field impressions to make decisions and field decisions. That's kind of what drives the stuff. What are we seeing in the field? And we're seeing that is changing. And we need to, or we are, whatever it is, relying more on external sources, forecasts and so on to make our decisions about what we do with our programs and in the field. And that really goes back to that field comms piece that was talked about before. A lot of folks talked about difficulty with their emergency response plans, in these cascading, events. And we're really used to response plans that go from point A to B, like, fatality, for example. This thing starts, it's linear, and it ends. And we're seeing that that's not what this is. These things are going on for weeks, seasons, months, years. And so those playbooks that we have in place, they're not designed for this, and they're not really working for this. And so that's a good takeaway. Okay, so in short here, programs, providers are experiencing these effects. Health questions, like long-term health questions, heat, air quality stuff, those are the big major concerns that stuck out of this survey. Folks are unsure where to go to for guidance. There's a lot of overlapping and contradictory recommendations and guidance out there. So, information is the need anyway. Interesting. Jeff mentioned this, and this came up in Brooklyn's presentation as well. A good example is adaptation. We didn't find a lot of that in our survey, what folks had mentioned. We found that folks are applying variances to their normal operating plans and what they're doing. We're not seeing a lot of evidence of adaptation. We know it's happening out there. Going back to Dr. Miller stuff, that's a really good example of adaptation. Coming out of Helene and what we're seeing in some programs there, Hurricane Helene, there's some good adaptation there, but it simply didn't come up in our survey. So that's that. Questions?
Awesome, Stu, thanks. Just stop sharing your screen for us so we can see everybody.
Yeah. Oops. Okay, there you go.
Great.
Well done, Stu. Any questions for Stu?
Or
And
Jeff
Stu?
or Shauna.
Okay, I have one. If to get the ball rolling, Stu. Anything I'm interested in? Well done on this piece of work. It's fantastic, and it's really interesting when we think about the Australian data that we've got now and that will be presented next as well, like the similarities and the real differences as well. I'm interested in, did anything surprise you as a research team, or what surprised you most out of this data and these findings?
I think we could all probably say different things, and we'll also probably say some of the same things. Be interested to know what Jeff and Shauna would say. For me, what stuck out is, that the conclusion about the adaptation versus the variations, and that hit me pretty hard, especially in my work, right? And like, oh yeah, that is absolutely true. Now we can start to see it. The other thing that stuck out to me is the need for information and clear, consistent information. We're all so oversaturated with stuff. It really aligned. I mean, it stuck out because it also struck a chord with me in my own work of like, yeah, the information is all over the map. And what is right? So,
Yeah, brilliant, fantastic. Jeff, you got a response to that?
But what struck me out of that, going through that, Stu and I spent most of our time in the qualitative data there. That really, we went through all those pieces in more detail. People were looking for permission to do things differently, but feeling bound by their histories. Nobody said that, but that's just as a collective. It's like they sense this is not working, but they don't feel like they can not do what they used to do.
Interesting.
Yeah, am I allowed to throw this out and start over? Nobody asked that, but that's really, people are looking for permission to do that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Shana, what about you? Interest in your perspective.
I'll pick only one answer. There are many, but I think the thing that surprised me is like we all learned how to do a lot of this work during COVID. And we didn't carry forth the lessons that COVID taught us about how to be nimble and adaptive into this new problem. We reverted back to our comfort zones. And that comes out in the data very clearly.
Love your work. Fantastic. Any other questions? Danny, I think you're putting your hand up. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I've got some strange Close Encounters kind of lighting, if you know that Steven Spielberg movie from
That's
back
all
in the
good.
day.
It suits you.
I guess I saw that 12%, I think you said, of the organizations we're proactively managing, meaning 88% were not. So Shanna, I'm not sure how to say your name. Obviously, COVID was taxing. There's a reason we didn't continue with that degree of vigilance, because it was exhausting. And I remember even getting, I'm sure this happened to a lot of you, you find websites, you still see their COVID protocol. Like we often got to a place where we just ran out of steam, and so I think that's what I'm seeing in the survey. What would be a takeaway for programs in terms of here's what you can do to proactively manage? I'd love some takeaways, action items.
Well, I think there's a finite amount of time we have to talk today. If you happen to be at the WRMC, we're actually going to give a workshop that tries to explore a bunch more of these adaptive things. But I think I'll just I'll focus on one, which is one of the things that we do exceptionally well in this industry is we do communication with people. Like we do the whole umbrella of informed consent. And that was something that we did really well in COVID. It was a scramble and it was exhausting and the rules changed every Friday. Like we know that. But we know we have the tool set, and so we don't have to invent a lot of new structure, but we need to go back to the structure that we have and make sure that it is inclusive now of new conversations, new risks, and we need to upskill our staff because while we've been very good at answering the question of, is your program safe? Like we know how to have that conversation about the risks we've managed for decades. We don't know how to have that conversation about these new risks. And that is part of what we need to operationalize is have those internal conversations, look at the tool set that we have and broaden the content so that it includes these new risks.
Awesome. Thanks, Shana. And yeah, wonderful conversation, everyone. We're gonna what a theme we've had this year, isn't it interesting? And so we're gonna close out the climate change theme with our second last presentation. Welcome to Australia. Thanks for getting up early. Much appreciated. And so we got Dr. Lauren Miller and we got Nikki Hansen from the National Centre for Outdoor Risk and Readiness as part of Outward Bound Australia. It's wonderful to have you online with us. And Lauren, please take us away. Perhaps tell us a bit about NatCor before you get going. And yeah, you're in for a treat to hear about the results of this survey from an Australian context.
Oh, thanks, Claire. And thanks to, I've got total FOMO in terms of like not being at WRMC to, really dive deeply into conversations and questions about that. But I'm just going to stand up and show you where I am because I'm in a very authentic outdoor location for Outward Bound Australia. And I don't know whether you can quite see the inlet down there in Walpole Wilderness area in southwest Australia, which is truly a remote and epic and extraordinary place to be. I do just want to call out to say hi from Nikki Hansen's perspective. And Nikki, do you want to just say hi and introduce yourself and maybe you do the what are we doing with NatCor?
Absolutely.
I think you're there
Thanks.
somewhere.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. Look, yeah, I'm Nikki Hansen. I am the project manager of NatCor. I came on board a couple of years ago, and really the idea behind NatCor was that Outward Bound. Am I telling your story,
No,
Lauren?
I've given you permission.
No.
I've given you permission to tell the story because you've been so instrumental in the work
okay,
we're
so
doing.
look, basically when you would have seen it all over the news that back in 2019-20 that the east coast of Australia had massive bushfires that just burned out of control for a long time. In that time, Outward Bound lost 3 operational areas in one hit. And that's 3 out of 4. The 4th one's here. So other side of the country. And the impact of that really spurred Lauren on to look at this from the perspective of, first of all, saving Outward Bound from the imminent, implications of that, because those fires were then followed by COVID. So she had the triple whammy, and looking at that from the perspective of how she made, or got Outward Bound through the quagmire, is something she wanted to share. And those, to do that on a national, stage was the impetus behind seeking government funding from a body that actually were giving out grants for climate-based resilience, climate change resilience, and formed the National Centre for Outdoor Risk and Readiness. So since then, what we've really been focused on is a co-design process. So Claire was heavily involved in the first one. I wasn't even there in terms of working with NatCor at that point. She and Lauren ran the first co-design workshop, which gathered information from the outdoor sector in Australia from a national perspective about what their greatest concern was in this space. From there, what we did is try and narrow down what are the things we can actually have some influence over and assist people with. So one of the biggest things was actually around accepting, number one, that there are going to be probably more incidents because there are things that are happening outside of our control, even with the best forecasting apps and so forth. So that's when we worked with Claire to put incident response workshops on the ground. So we've run 14 of them over the last 18 months. And across multiple states in Australia, have had really, really great uptake with that. And then what we've done is we've actually created a relationship with the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia. And we are right on the cusp of actually putting some, well, first of all, with them, we got into a situation with them where we decided we wanted to do the survey, which Lauren's going to present the results of, about weather forecasting, and similar sort of stuff to what Stuart was talking about, but you'll see it from an Australian context. But we did that, we co-designed that with the Bureau of Met. So that was key, having them in the room with us, and because there's a lot of mistrust in Australia in the outdoor sector around forecasting, particularly around things that Lauren will show you on there. So I think it was a little bit of a PR exercise as well with the Bureau to rebuild a bit of trust there and have them in the room with us. Now what we're going to be doing with them is, based on these survey results, is then we're going to now be putting weather-based PD on the ground that includes the Bureau in 2025. And I think that's
Thanks,
about
Nikki.
all from me.
That's totally. I thought, oh, you're going to keep going and do the whole presentation. But I think you'll see it's a brilliant. Stewie's was a brilliant segue, really, for us, because we're probably now taking the deep dive, and today's presentation is sharing that and what it means for weather. So I'm going to share screen and get going. Can everybody see that?
That's good. Yeah.
Okay, great. So survey-based, best way for us to communicate, I think, across the sector. And we did this in February this year. And we had 140 responses from the sector. And today we'll go through those results in 4 parts. The call for action in terms of what we need, in terms of better weather forecasting, organisational readiness, how ready are our organisations to be adaptive, some really strong themes from Stewie's feedback too. What are our specific weather forecasting needs? Like, what do we like to see and what sources are we getting them from? We had pretty good representation right across Australia, and indeed the range of responses were from outdoor education providers within schools, commercial and not-for-profit education providers, clubs, some emergency services people and land managers. So similar to you, Stu, we're sort of getting a cross-sector response and Australia-wide. In terms of the call for action, and there's some really interesting, I'm not a behavioural psychologist, but there are some interesting behavioural psychology sort of trends here. Most people were pretty confident, oh yeah, I know what's happening with the weather and I know how I'm, know how to make decisions based on getting forecast. Some, less so, but the bulk of outdoor providers pretty confident with their skills. But they are less confident that they're actually up to date with global best practice. We didn't define it, by the way, but that they're up to date with the best access to information. And I think one of the things that we're really aware of, and you'll see it later in the range of sources, is that technology is rapidly changing, sources of information are changing. And so this question of, well, how do you know what you might think you're okay, but how do you know that you're actually up to date with it? And so a really low level of confidence that people are up to date. And indeed, only 25% of respondents have received training on weather forecasting interpretation in the last 5 years. And those that had received it, they were respondents who did so in TAFE or uni in their outdoor entry. So a real gap in the marketplace associated with are our practitioners accessing PD on weather forecasting as our weather changes and as technology changes. And interestingly enough, 77% of respondents didn't actually know where to go to find professional development on accessing and interpreting weather. Commercial providers, 52%, not-for-profits actually had more information on where to go to provide them, which was really interesting. And only a quarter of organisations are actually providing training for their staff on weather forecasting interpretation. So some real call for action evidence there. And 94% they said they'd be interested in more training and training specific to an outdoor practitioner's needs. In terms of organisational readiness, and Stewie, it was good to see some common themes in your presentation here. This was quite curious. 60% have a formal process for accessing weather information when you're in that planning phase. And they're using seasonal outlooks, checking weather forecasts, they're using SOPs and policies and doing risk planning and assessments, and a little bit of use of thresholds and triggers in that planning phase. And again, 60% have a formal process for accessing weather information when they're actually running an outdoor program. What I found fascinating was these were different 60%. So they kind of almost did one or the other, but not both, which I thought was interesting. And once again, it was, formal processes were regular weather check-ins, paying attention to severe weather warnings, use of thresholds and triggers, and SOPs and policies. Weather warning thresholds, and this is a really interesting topic, I think, for the sector. Weather warning thresholds are used by 70% of organisations. There are different approaches, and it's almost two ends of a spectrum here. Those that are looking for really definitive, if it's over 35 degrees, don't go, we cancel, or if the wind is, over 40 knots, don't go. Versus those who are very much more aware that this is an issue of professional judgment. That's what we are. We're outdoor professionals. Weather will change. We need to rely on our professional judgment and experience in terms of how to apply thresholds, because of course every different location is, wind means one thing in one spot and another in another spot, and it depends on your participants as to who's what their capability levels are. When we looked at and we asked people about thresholds, it was a dog's breakfast. It was kind of a really fascinating insight because, what thresholds are you using for heat, for example? And they were all over the place. Some are using them, some aren't. And this varied enormously. from heat to, you know, wind to rainfall, and so forth. So, and there was a call really to say, oh, it'd be useful to sort of like see what other people's thresholds are. And the other thing, of course, about thresholds is that some of them are applied externally by a range of external agents. And this would be true, I'm sure, in all of our jurisdictions. Sometimes it's not our threshold, it's the National Park calls it quits because they close at their threshold. Or education departments have their own set of thresholds, or state emergency services put out the evacuation warning. So there's other players within this threshold space that are impacting us externally, and to some extent the question of, well, shouldn't we organise ourselves to say what are our thresholds and try to be a part of that conversation. Severe weather warnings are, of course, the one that we all pay most attention to, but are they really tailored to consider an outdoor practitioner's needs, and are they really practical? And this one is from me. You know, this one pinged me at 11:28 in an area where right adjacent to where we operate. Fortunately, we didn't have any kids in the field that night. But what do you do when, you know, they ping a severe weather warning at 11:28 p.m. and say severe weather, shelter indoors now, when you're in, you know, you've got kids way out in the bush? It's just not that practical. We're not getting the sort of severe weather warning advice in that instance that is actually going to be practical or implementable. But indeed, if it, you know, you then end up in a coroner's court, it's sort of like, well, they told you to shelter indoors at 11:30, you know, so how do we respond in those circumstances? Here's another behavioural one that I found really interesting. Most are confident that they know how to respond to a severe weather warning, but are less confident when it comes to, could I provide another person with enough warning to respond adequately to a severe weather event? 25% think, oh, no, actually, I'd be fine, but I'm not sure I can, you know, advise somebody else. So they're actually concerned when it starts to get to this question of, you've got duty of care of others. And of course, that's, you know, the name of our game, which is really interesting. So weather forecasting needs, we got some really good solid feedback across 7 different factors of what is it we're asking for. We want to know the source and ownership of an intent of who's providing the weather forecasts. We want to know that their reputation and reliability. We want to know the level of accuracy for the local terrain that we're in. We want to also look at frequency and timeliness, like how up to date it is. The big one for us, how user-friendly is the experience? Can you navigate the websites and access the information that we're after? We're also after local interpretation and also welcoming multiple source comparison. Although when you have multiple sources of information, then what do you do with the comparative information when there's conflicting differences in it is also a challenge. In Australia, in terms of ranking our natural hazard concerns, thunderstorms and lightning is the biggest one, and that might be a little bit swayed by the fact that our Bureau of Meteorology doesn't provide lightning forecasting. So I think there's partly a message in there that we're not getting the information that we want. But otherwise, strong winds and gusts, bushfire, heavy or continuous rain. Heat is down at number 5, which is interesting in comparison to yours, Stewie. Flood, hail, landslide. I would actually say landslides is a really interesting one, because I think we're probably seeing some of the biggest impact in terms of closures and on particular businesses arises from the landslides, which typically for us in Australia is the fire first, then the floods and the landslides, and the roads are closed and in some instances not open for years, or whether or not they ever will open again is another one. And the importance of information, we want to know location. First, where is this? Is this actually going to hit me? And this is a part of the challenge with Australia, is that it's a very big land mass, and there are quite a lot of low population areas. And so the investment in weather station infrastructure in some of those lower population areas where outdoor practitioners like to go is not always as reliable or accurate as you would like. Southwest Western Australia is a classic because, of course, all the weather comes off the sea and there's no other landmass out over that way for them to put weather stations. So we're in an interesting spot as an example here. Timing, severity are the other ones with chance listed as 4, and the way in which our Bureau has approached chance has caused confusion, I think, for many in interpretation as well. We'd like more specific timely storm information is a big issue for us. People have been caught out with it. You don't know whether it's coming or it's not coming. And they can be quite specifically local too. We'd like BOM is our acronym for the Bureau of Meteorology. We'd like the BOM to pay more attention to people outdoors. You know, they've typically focused on where do people live, and of course we know where we're going. It's not about where we live. It's actually where are people in the outdoors. We want more weather station coverage. We also need help navigating what's available through BOM, and as Nikki said, that we're trying to work closely with them to develop that relation. There's also a call for less fragmentation of information and a national approach, because we're very state-based when it comes to emergency services responses, and a lot of the information around bushfires, floods and so forth is through state-based information. And there is a big concern too about the risk of unnecessary cancellation when these warnings are coming through and then the weather doesn't arise, the implications of that. In terms of weather information sources, no surprises here. Most people are now using weather websites and weather apps, and indeed there's a lot of use of sort of subscribing for alerts and so forth, which is really good. Emergency services and local government are another big player within this space. The thing that surprised me, though, probably to the extent of this, and this is just a survey of 140 of outdoor practitioners, is that there are over 100 different named sources that people are using for accessing information. And this was across the 10 different types of weather forecasts. So it includes what are you using for weather forecasts, climate outlooks, for heat, for floods, for cyclones, for snow, and so forth. So some of them I'd never heard of. Some of them are, you know, relevant for some parts of the country and not for other. But when you actually go, if people are using 100 different sources and we don't actually have training on what's best or what's best for me in this certain spot, it's a bit of a quagmire in terms of, you know, just word of mouth. Oh, have you tried this one or that one and so forth? And there could be some brilliant stuff we're missing out on. But this is, you know, this was to me was a real, holy dooly. The other thing that we sort of struggled with a bit in Australia is that we've been trying to find who are the gurus, like, you know, who are the weather gurus in the outdoors sector, and we haven't really been able to find a collective group of outdoor practitioners who are also weather nerds. So we actually feel like we need to grow that ecosystem. I loved when I was over at WRMC last year meeting Luke Meyer from Alaska and thought, wow, we want to find our own Luke in Australia. But I think we're going to have to grow one. So this is just giving an example of we analysed by different type of weather event where people were sourcing them. So just as a summary of key messages, you know, for us from this exercise, there are a bunch of key messages for the outdoors sector. You know, we need to develop more training in weather decision support, both in relation to organisational readiness and weather information. We're also looking to build a community of weather experts and also engage with researchers for learning and publications. We need to be involved in considering the threshold guidelines for the review of the AAAS. And we also need to highlight and lobby the need for outdoor sector specific needs in relation to weather services. And then there's a range of things that we're wanting from our Bureau in terms of our wish list, without wanting to sound like demanding children, getting this voice as a small and dispersed community into the Bureau is something that we're really trying to do, and I think making some headway on. So that's it in terms of this piece of work for us. And yeah, we're trying to translate this into professional development. There's just one more thing that I'll say too in relation to a segue from your comment, Stewie. We actually are looking at developing a in process at the moment, an incident reporting tool that will track business disruption and track incident impact associated with weather information. So we've got that in development at the moment because we think we do need to collate this information if there's if you change plans or you stop, we need to actually understand and try and track that information as to how it's impacting us. So that's something that we're hoping to be able to bring to the Australian sector next year. I'm going to stop sharing and call it there. I'm not sure how I went on time, Claire. I just went.
Freestyle. Thanks, Lauren. So I have a bigger picture question out of this. So that's you're right. That's a fine-grained needs analysis. What's that going to do? So what would change if let's imagine that you got your wish list? What would look different then? The weather still comes. Now then what?
Yeah. Well, look, I think for us, what we're hoping is that we actually at least have develop a capacity for professional development within the sector such that we are able to access and have our skills so that we are better skilled up to understand what's coming so that we get better warning and better capacity and more nuanced potential to adapt. Really, that's what it's going to be. And I think it's just that sense of let's making sure that we're creating the noise to get the information that will help us with lead time to adapt. But you're right, Jeff, the weather's going to keep coming. But I think if we can, the better warning that we can get, the more accurate warning, the more that our adaptation can be appropriate and we can avoid unnecessary adaptation too, is probably what I would hope. And where we kind of want to start keeping tracking on it too is that we kind of want to understand what the level of impacts are, because as Stewie's evidence suggests, some are just still, it's still a 1 or 100-year flood, so it won't happen for another 100 years. Whether others are aware that actually it's a more systemic change that we need to sort of adapt to. So hopefully we'll get a bit more information on that as well.
Can I just add one comment
Yeah,
to
Nikki.
that, which is that in Australia, different to you guys with your forecasting services, Bureau of Meteorology and other private forecasting firms, their focus is on aviation, agriculture, that kind of, and mining, those sort of big buck areas. We just don't have a seat at the table. So what we're trying to do is show them who we are. They just don't know how many people. And I don't know whether it's the same in the States, but getting that quantifiable data about who we are, how many people are impacted, how many people are actually outdoors, that we are taking outdoors, and showing them that we are actually a really big number of people and that we are worthy of their attention, and that, having, a warning service that is specific to our context.
Great. Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, Lauren. Lovely to have you both with us, and thanks again for your work. It's fantastic work. I think you all know, if you would like to follow up with these folks, you know how to get a hold of them. So thanks again. Let's stay in Australia now for our final presentation. We're going to take a sharp left turn. We're going to come off of climate change and the impacts of climate change. And I'd love to welcome Dr. Jolene Cox from the Center for Human Factors and Socio-Technical Systems at the University of the Sunshine Coast, who is going to share some brilliant research that they've been doing on help-seeking behavior in young people on lead outdoor activity programs. Jolene, over to you.
Thanks, Claire. Perfect timing for this session this morning, whole morning for me. I actually dropped my toddler off to daycare, and there are all the kids there, and they were actually on their way to a lead outdoor activity. So perfect timing.
Brilliant.
Today's session, I thought. All right, so I'll share my screen. Probably run into some tech issues, but let's see how we go.
That's your driver's screen.
Oh, and what? How's that now?
Well done. You're laughing. That's it.
Awesome. Yes, so just a little bit about myself. So I am a research fellow at the Center for Human Factors and Socio-Technical Systems, a very wordy name for our center, at the University of the Sunshine Coast. So my background is actually in quite a different area. So I did my PhD in visual cognition, so very experimental psychology. But since joining the research center at the university, I sort of pivoted my work to sort of more human factors and complex systems research. And now I'm sort of looking and applying those methods and theories into societal health and well-being. So here I am today presenting on some work that we did, I think last year or the year before, looking at adolescents' help-seeking behaviors and intentions for psychosocial problems, specifically in lead outdoor activities. So I just would like to quickly acknowledge my research team, Melissa Trapp, who really conducted this research for her psychology research year at the university with myself and Dr. Scott McLean, who is a senior research fellow at the center as well. I also like to acknowledge the funding for this project, the Australian Research Council, who funded the Uploads project, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. So just some background. So we have all been an adolescent once in our life or have adolescents currently. So you all should know that adolescence is a particularly vulnerable period for psychosocial problems to manifest. Psychosocial problems, they're broadly defined as difficulties in areas of personal and social functioning. So they can arise from adverse circumstances, for example, experiences of bullying, conflict, stigma, and even daily hassles. And psychosocial problems can contribute to not only, a transient temporary emotional distress that they're experiencing, but that can also lead to more severe mental health issues that persist into adulthood. And critically, the point I want to make here is that psychosocial problems are often invisible to external observers. So now here's the problem. We know that adequate and appropriate support can minimize the impacts of psychosocial problems, but this would really require young people to actively seek help. Again, as I said, because a lot of these psychosocial problems are invisible to observers. But a lot of young people perceive many barriers to help seeking, and then they don't seek help. And the consequences of that is that many psychosocial problems will then go undetected, and then young people are left unsupported. There is already a large body of literature on adolescents help seeking, for example, finding gender differences in help seeking. Anecdotally, we all know that female adolescents demonstrate greater help-seeking intentions and behaviors compared to male adolescents. We found preferences in help-seeking sources. Males are more likely to seek help from informal sources like their friends or family, but females are more likely to seek help from formal sources like your general practitioners, counselors, and mental health professionals. What this evidence tells us is that males do seek help, contrary to what we think, but it probably depends on the context in which help is available and how this help source is being evaluated. So overall, despite the large body of research that exists in this area, I make the argument that help seeking is still poorly understood. Help seeking rates are still really low. And there are many reasons for it, but the two that we'll focus on today is that previous studies often used hypothetical scenarios or vignettes, so people can't, people are expected to relate to those scenarios to provide a response, and that's often not the case. They're not able to relate to those scenarios, and a lot of studies are not focused on specific settings as well. They're just asking about help seeking more generally. So in this study, we focus on led outdoor activities. So in Australia, annually, tens of thousands of adolescents participate in led outdoor activities. These include activities like instructed outdoor activities such as high ropes courses, orienteering, camp cooking, team building, bike riding, abseiling, and water sports. These are just some examples. A fundamental characteristic of these activities is the deliberate engagement of these activities with increased levels of risk to achieve that learning and developmental outcomes that they're after. And this increased risk is associated with physical injury and psychosocial incidents in our young people. So, we have this incident reporting and learning system called the Understanding and Preventing Led Outdoor Activities Data System, or uploads in short. So that was implemented in Australian led outdoor activities sector to really allow us to understand adverse incidents and, importantly, prevent future occurrences of such incidents. Uploads has been used by, my last count, but it's more now, more than 130 led outdoor activity organizations with over 14,000 injuries, illness, psychosocial, near miss, and environmental and equipment incidents reported. So it's really like a gold mine of a data set for us. So in the present study, we had really just two quite straightforward aims. The first one is to investigate whether there are gender differences in adolescents' help-seeking behaviors for psychosocial problems in led outdoor activities. And to address this aim, we used the psychosocial incident data that was reported to Uploads, that data system that I just spoke about. And then the second aim was to investigate whether there are gender differences in adolescents' help-seeking intentions for psychosocial problems in led outdoor activities. And to do this, we administered an online survey. So I'll just briefly go through the methods that we use. So I'm just going to I'm going to talk to research question 1 or aim 1 as phase 1, and then aim 2 as phase 2. So for phase 1 of the study, like I said, we looked at the psychosocial incident reports from Uploads, realized that misspelling there, and we looked at reports that were submitted between 2018 to 2022. And the reports have to involve an adolescent aged between 13 to 17 years. So with that criteria, we retrieved reports involving 174 adolescents, and I'll call them participants from now, and it involved 72 males and 102 females. We coded those reports into 2 categories, and they would only fit in one, not both. So the first category is where the participant actively sought help. So an example of a report, report description is that the participant approached teacher coordinating the camp during a session and expressed distress. So they are actively seeking help there. The other category is where an adult observed the participant experiencing a psychosocial problem, but the adolescent or the participant did not actively seek help. So, an example there is group leaders noticed participant had become very quiet, removed herself from group settings, and was unlike her usual personality. So that was noted by one of the group leaders in the report. In phase 2, so we used an online survey here to address that second aim. There were 2 main parts to the online survey. So the first one is a help-seeking intentions questionnaire. And that one really looked at aspects of help-seeking intentions. So things like the conscious planning to seek help, the perception of effort required when seeking help, their willingness to communicate psychosocial problems, their perception of the problem, whether it was serious enough to seek help, and the perceived support available for them. So those were sort of aspects we looked at in that questionnaire. And then the second survey or second questionnaire as part of the survey is a general help seeking questionnaire. So that was just the general intentions to seek help from several formal and informal help sources. So, you know, are you likely to seek help from your parent or a parent, other relative or family member, a mental health professional, so a formal source of help? And we actually adapted the questionnaire to include specifically led outdoor activity supervisor. So adolescents aged 13 to 17 years residing in Australia and have attended a led outdoor activity program in the last 3 years were invited to participate in this survey. We are really sort of trying to reach that really early adolescent age. So we only had 39 adolescents participated. Not all of them completed the whole survey. And so really after exclusions for either incomplete responses or a lack of consent. So they opened the survey, but they didn't consent. So we can't really go through with the data or any data that it provided. So we ended up with 20 data from 22 participants, 12 males, 10 females for analysis. And the mean age of this sample was nearly 15 years. So looking at results for phase 1, so just a reminder, this is where we looked at help-seeking behaviors with the uploads data. So we found significant association between gender and help-seeking behavior for psychosocial problems. What we found, just very briefly, is that more female adolescents sought help. So they actively sought help for psychosocial problems in led outdoor activities compared to their male counterparts. But more male adolescents were observed experiencing a psychosocial problem compared to female adolescents. So this is where, you know, sort of the supervisor or the group leader noticed that the adolescent was needing help. And then, you know, that was noted in the reports. And for phase 2, so again, here we're looking at their help-seeking intention, so not their behavior, but just how likely they are to seek help in the future. We actually found no gender differences in the aspects, any of the aspects we looked at in help-seeking intentions. And there was also no gender differences in seeking help from an adult in a led outdoor activity setting. But what we found was that irrespective of gender, so, you know, male or female, adolescents who have sought help in the past for a psychosocial problem were more likely to seek help in the future. So I think, you know, that there's a lot of research supporting that. And it really shows, you know, like how the experiences of previous help seeking can shape future help seeking intentions. So just a quick summary of findings. So, you know, we found gender differences in another typo I noticed in help-seeking behaviors, but no gender differences in help-seeking intentions. And then, as I said, past help-seeking behaviors was associated with future help-seeking. So I think, you know, where we found gender differences in help-seeking behaviors, but not in help-seeking intentions, I think that's, for me, like that's really an interesting finding because it reflects an intention behavior gap here where, you know, one, you know, whether they intend to perform a behavior and whether they're actually actualized to a behavior. So I think that's quite interesting. And we sort of thought maybe the intention behavior gap that we found in this study may be more apparent in male adolescents compared to female adolescents. It could be due to that. And the barriers to help seeking may be actually greater and more difficult for male adolescents to overcome when compared to female adolescents, and that reduces the likelihood of them seeking help. So just some strengths and limitations of our study. So really, we saw our strengths as, you know, the use and analysis of secondary data from uploads, which really, like I said, it's a gold mine of data. We've got more than 14,000 incident data reported there. And while the psychosocial incident data was not actually collected for the purposes of this study, because the data reflected adolescent sort of behaviors and incidents that occurred in this naturalistic setting, we were able to sort of get some sort of real life behavior happening there, which is, I think, you know, really good for psychological research. Additionally, the large number of organizations across Australia participating in the project meant that, you know, we have so much data there across everywhere in Australia. We can sort of argue that it's generalizable to adolescents participating in the Australian outdoor activity sector. The second strength is the development and administration of that help-seeking intentions questionnaire. So big kudos to my student. This was a really, you know, it was a 60-item comprehensive questionnaire that she developed from previous research reviews. She pulled together all, you know, the relevant questions from validated measures, and really that survey, that questionnaire carefully considered the constructs of help-seeking intention. So I think that, you know, that's definitely a strength there. But I have to caveat and say that that questionnaire was newly developed, so it sort of needs further, more thorough psychometric validation there. Limitations of the study, and therefore, you know, sort of caution to the results that are presented today, especially for the second survey, not phase 2, not phase 1. It's that small sample size. So typically we want more representative number of young people, but we really had some recruitment challenges where, because of ethical concerns, we had to get parents to consent to their adolescent taking part. So we were really trying to target parents as part of our recruitment drive, and I'm not sure we actually had the right tools and resources to do that. But, you know, I guess more research, and we really want to hear from young people. So, you know, we'll start exploring how else we can reach young people better, maybe through schools would be another avenue there. So just conclusions and implications. So I think for future help-seeking research, it will be really beneficial to explore adolescents' help-seeking behaviors and intentions in specific settings rather than general settings. For the LED outdoor activity sector, it will be really beneficial to consider the implementation of gender-appropriate strategies, such as strategies to assist male adolescents on how to recognize and communicate their need for help, or the use, you know, of help-seeking role models who are male. So if they see males seeking help, maybe they are more likely to seek help as well. Another consideration more broadly in the help-seeking research is the possible increase of mental health literacy and awareness amongst young people. I mean, it's more prevalent in society today, but we don't really know the impacts on adolescents help-seeking. We're not really measuring it very well, especially in LED outdoor activity settings where it's quite specific, quite different from everyday life. So, you know, do we need to think about increasing mental health literacy and awareness specifically for LED outdoor activity settings? So that's just a question for us to all consider. So thank you so much for having me. If you have any questions, open the floor up. Feel free to contact me if you have other questions, or if you want to collaborate. The research is published and it's open access, so you can scan the QR code there and that will take you straight to the published paper if you want to read more about it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jolene. If you want to stop sharing, we'll get everybody back up on the screen. Thank you. That was fantastic. Any questions, comments for Jolene?
Jolene, I have a couple thoughts. One, the uploads data.
Yes.
Beyond the basic coding of whether there's intention or not, was there context around that? So my thought is this: not all intentions are the same. There's minor issues and there's major issues. is there room to go back and recode, or was there coding down around that? And I also thought, is there genders attached to that? Maybe is there a different threshold for one group who reports more earlier than another group who actually waits and has a higher threshold for what they deem help worthy to need to go and get help? Any indication in the data there?
Yeah, so in terms of the context, we do have, those reports are quite detailed because they are sort of, all of them are done by not the adolescent themselves, but, descriptions from the group leaders and the supervisors. So they are very detailed. We do have contextual information around, what the particular problem was. But for privacy reasons, sort of, I didn't present that aspect of it. In terms of your letter question, no, those reports don't really talk about sort of the threshold or, when or how early or late, they are experiencing the psychosocial problem. So yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting thought though, because help seeking can be quite dynamic. You may choose to seek help very early on or not, depending on how you view your severity of the issue. So yeah, that's definitely an important question to look at in this help seeking research.
Great, thank you. Elliot.
Hey, I had a quick question. Your last comment when you were talking about how, like, is it changing like adolescents' awareness about health seeking? I work at an independent school and they are all very much aware and very articulate. So I was just curious if there was any points in the data where you were able to like distinguish between kind of that's also, economical and kind of where the population are for kids and whether that affects how if they're more willing to talk about or seek help, asking for help. Yeah.
So we didn't look at mental health literacy or how much they know about mental health in terms of whether they would seek help or have sought help in the past. So that wasn't a factor that we looked at. But I just thought that, like, we really thought of it as we were thinking about the results from the study and, the context that we live in today more broadly. And that really came up for me because, like you said, we are actually, bringing more and more awareness of mental health into schools and stuff. But what I don't know is that actually translating to help seeking because they know more about mental health issues? Are they actually seeking help more, or do they just know more? And that's great knowledge for them. But what are the outcomes from it? I don't know if we've evaluated that well in Australia and also worldwide. So I think that's more of a broader, like, open question. What do we know about, these programs?
Yeah, it'd be cool because it'd also be interesting to see, like, does that also change with populations and who the students are? Are they coming from one school?
That's right.
And like an open enrollment type program. Cool.
Yeah,
Really interesting thinking.
I know just anecdotally, like my friends, I have friends who teach at schools here in Canberra where I'm based, not actually based in Queensland, but they were telling us over dinner one day that this school had introduced like an app where students would go in and, daily tracking of their mood and their mental health. And it was really introduced post-COVID. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And I don't know if other schools are doing that. It was a private school, so I don't know if, they just had more resources or it's just a particular population that they wanted to test this with. But yeah, like whether that translates to more help seeking and better mental health outcomes for these young children. I'm curious.
Good on you. Thanks, Jolene. Interestingly, in terms of the apps, they're being used more and more now in lots and lots of schools and in workplaces. So that's quite interesting. We'll probably be seeing some more research from those in the coming years and findings. And in some ways, that brings us to a close of this year's symposium, which is, who knows where we're going to be and what we're going to be speaking about and what we're going to be hearing from researchers around the world next year. It's interesting that this year was very much, again, probably not surprising, very much heavily skewed towards climate change, taking that sharp left to Jolene's and colleagues' work. And, a big thanks from us for that. The recording for this will be going live very shortly. The website name is, Jeff?
Adventure Risk Research Symposium.blogspot.com, or just Google Adventure Risk Research.
And you can get the proceedings from a couple of years ago, 3 years, I think, in a row, maybe
No,
three.
all six, all
All
five,
set,
all
all five.
five are up
Okay,
now.
all there.
6 now, yeah.
So they're all there. Stay tuned for the papers that will come out. But again, thanks so much to all our presenters. Thanks to all of you for hanging out for a couple of hours with us. And best of luck, and we'll see you all again next year.
Thanks for joining us, folks. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you.